Hello, welcome to the Online Ethics Center's Spring 2022 webinar series, Bringing Ethics into the Conversation. So my name is Caitlin Wylie. I'm an assistant professor in Science, Technology, and Society at the University of Virginia, where I teach engineering ethics and data ethics. So the Online Ethics Center is hosted at the University of Virginia. It is a digital repository for resources on teaching and learning about ethics in engineering and science. The OEC also fosters a community of faculty, students, researchers, and other professionals who come together to discuss ethics. So please check out our website at onlineethics.org. The theme of our spring webinar series is sustainability and environmental justice. This series is sponsored by the Program in Science, Technology, and Society at the University of Virginia. And I'm delighted to host our speaker today, Dr. Jessica M. Smith, who's going to start us off on our spring series. So Dr. Smith is an anthropologist and STS scholar whose research interests center on energy ethics, engineering, and public accountability. She is associate professor in the Engineering, Design, and Society Department at the Colorado School of Mines, where she also directs the Humanitarian Engineering and Science graduate program. She is the author of the new book, Extracting Accountability, Engineers and Corporate Social Responsibility, which was published by MIT Press in 2021. And is available fully open access, so you can go and read it right now. The book was funded by the National Science Foundation and the British Academy. Dr. Smith's first book was called Mining, Coal and Undermining Gender, Rhythms of Work and Family in the American West, and was published by Rutgers in 2014. And that book was also funded by the NSF and by the National Endowment for the Humanities. And Dr. Smith has written and edited multiple journal special issues on energy ethics. So today, Dr. Smith is going to speak first, and then she'll have a discussion with Dr. Gwen Ottinger, who is Associate Professor of Politics and STS at Drexel University. And then we'll have time for questions from you. So to ask a question, please type in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and then I'll read your question to Dr. Smith and Dr. Ottinger. So Dr. Smith, thanks so much for being here. Over to you.
Thank you. I'm really pleased to be here and to be able to share this virtual space with you all. And I want to especially thank Caitlin for the introduction and for the invitation, and Gwen for generously agreeing to serve as the discussant, given her own really important research in this area. Mines and the Humanitarian Engineering Program are really proud to support the OEC, especially through the leadership of our good colleague, Carl Mitchum. Today, what I'd like to do is use my research to address a central concern for both engineering studies and engineering ethics. And those are the dilemmas posed by the corporate context of most US engineers' work. I'll be coming from the perspective of anthropological theories of personhood and how they might help us think through some of those dilemmas. These were evocatively laid out in the haunting conclusion to Edwin Layton's treatise on the evolution of social responsibility in the US engineering professions during the progressive era. In my work, I bring ethnography to bear on this question of intertwined souls, ethics, and corporations. You'll note that my own focus are the mining and oil and gas industries. These have always been strongly scrutinized, but even more so in the unfolding global climate crisis and prominent successful protest movements. Even though these are clearly particular kinds of industries with specific material bases that come to matter, I'll propose that we can still distill themes about the corporate context of engineers' work that are broadly applicable beyond them. As Caitlin mentioned, this research was funded by a 5-year grant from the NSF's Cultivating Cultures for Ethical STEM program, which we are very grateful for. It involved both ethnographic research to understand the intersection of corporate social responsibility and engineering, as well as engineering education research, studying how we could use those insights gained through ethnographic research to enrich undergraduate engineering ethics training at 4 different universities in the US. The ethnographic research drew from participant observation in active mines, in well sites, accompanying engineers as they were doing their community engagement activities. A lot of semi-structured interviews, about 75 of them, the majority of whom were engineers working in these industries, as well as some archival research to understand the history of these conflicts in Colorado. I eventually came to understand my research also as one that involved critical participation in the vein of Gary Downey, because Mines, as many of you know, is a STEM dominant institution that has historic strong ties with the mining and oil and gas industries. And so in a very real sense, when I would show up to campus in my teaching and my research and being a part of that community, I was studying kind of this space that I was also a member of in some ways. So what I note is that in the language that we use in our everyday discourse, as well as academic writing, is that with few particularly egregious examples of individual culpability or heroic examples of individual whistleblowing, our language tends to treat corporations as monolithic, internally coherent entities, like a Western individual. For example, that there could be one BHP Billiton, a singular BP, or that an undifferentiated Facebook made a particular decision. This approach is valuable for some purposes, such as establishing legal liability for harm, but it runs the risk of obscuring more fundamental insights about the nature of corporate practice, as well as engineers' experiences of corporate work and their attempts to navigate the dilemmas they face. I'll argue that the framework of relational personhood, rather than the individualistic one that we're accustomed to, has much to offer how we theorize and study both corporate forms and the people who enact them, including engineers. So as an anthropologist, for me, personhood is the state of being recognized as a social, embodied, and sentient being. Personhood is a social construction that is fundamentally moral in nature, as it involves both our experiences of who we and others are and our aspirations for who we and others ought to be. It's common to analyze personhood through this heuristic of individualistic personhood that we associate with the West and relational personhood that we tend to associate elsewhere. And these are clearly ideal types that would kind of, and the strict divisions between them would dissolve when we look at kind of the nitty gritty of everyday life, but they're useful analytic devices. So individualistic personhood is the kind of personhood that most of us are accustomed to, that it's natural, that it's bounded, that it's coterminous with our bodies, that it's unique. We're all different people. We are self-aware, self-determining, autonomous, independent, and fully realized. And when people kind of in our world end up not being able to fulfill all of those qualities as they age, as they experience other kinds of injuries, kind of we see that their personhood comes into question. On the other hand, this idea of relational personhood really emerges from ethnography of Marilyn Strathern, who did her research in Melanesia. And what she argues is in this view, the person is a plural and composite site of the relationships that produced them. So we can think about the person as kind of a node in this web or this network, instead of the person as this billiard ball in the individualistic view of it. So this means that bodies are thought of as very differently. So instead of the body being coterminous with the person, they're really this social microcosm. And as you can see, this would have very distinct implications for how we think about agency, so the capacity to act, as well as accountability. In our view, we tend to view whatever this body does as the result of individual will. Whereas if we're taking a relational notion of personhood, what something that a body does could be the result of things that happened all around that network and web. So relational personhood has been productively applied to corporate forms. As we mentioned earlier, corporations are often treated as individual persons juridically, with the power to sue and be sued, to enter into and break contracts, and to be held accountable for harm. But what Welker shows through her long-term research inside of one of the world's largest mining companies is that corporations actually act in the world and negotiate their public accountabilities through the everyday practices of their employees. This perspective opens up what can be perceived externally as this unitary entity into a collective one that's characterized by internal fissures and contradictions. So far from being a monolithic entity, the appearance of a united corporate face with a common set of goals and values is actually an accomplishment rather than a state of being. So in her work, corporations must be made to hang together in the face of competing enactments and contestations over its boundaries and interests. And this doesn't mean that corporations are not powerful. What it means is that a great deal of their power comes from the fact that they're partable, composite, multiple, and in flux. What my research shows is that employees of these corporate forms also experience a kind of relational personhood. So even though the engineers I came to know maintained bounded notions of themselves as individuals with particular histories and personalities, the corporate context of their work meant that they were not always the authors of their own actions, as they had to follow directives from managers. They had to work with the aspirations and kind of directions from their coworkers, and sometimes in conflict with other teams. And they also found that their own agencies were expressed by other people because they had to hand off their work, and they were always trying to influence the activities and ethical leanings of the others that they shared this space with. So it was almost never that they were assigned one task that they would uniquely be responsible for. They were always working with others and with others in mind. So I'd like to give you one example of an engineer to illustrate how they experience this paradox of individual creativity, which is of a person that thinks and acts at once as themselves and through others. So June was a seasoned mining engineer who was approaching retirement, and she had spent many years working for corporations and described vividly kind of the frustrations that she experienced. She was an early advocate for what would later be called the social license to operate, and really wanted to take community well-being and acceptance as a constraint when she was doing her pit designs, which was her specialty. And she was never working alone as she was working on this pit design. So she had a team, and they were kind of taking all of the information and data produced by others. They had to work with designs produced by others to try to create their proposals. There were these kind of ghosts of other people and their knowledge and their kind of ethics embedded into everything they were working with. She eventually found it so frustrating trying to align kind of the ethical proclivities of her coworkers with her own, that she became a consultant, and so that she could just work by herself and choose which project she was going to consult on. But even in that case, she was never just herself. So she still had to take in information and desires and mandates from others in creating this design, and then hand it off. So kind of her work would be realized through other people's actions. And so she was brought into a pretty controversial project in South America that had experienced a significant amount of conflict, because the original pit design would have moved this collection of rocks that were sacred to the people who were living there. And so she took in all of the others' work and their desires and assumptions, and she built a mine design that would leave those rocks in place. It was very successful, so much so that the project was purchased by a major mining multinational, which is very common, from the smaller company that she had been working for. And they eventually scrapped her whole plan. They went back to the one that was more economic, that would access more of the resources, but also sacrifice that kind of sacred space. And it just drove her nuts, because she didn't have kind of the ability to see her work through. But she also took it as one of the kind of prerequisites of doing this kind of engineering work, that she was always kind of working with and through others. So as you can see, this more relational sense of personhood emphasizes the distributed nature of engineers' agencies as well as their accountabilities. And this is what can be really frustrating for people trying to hold these corporations to greater account. In engineering ethics, this has been theorized as a problem of many hands that apply to engineers' work in an organizational context. And it also illustrates something that anthropologist and STS scholar Chris Kelty calls a fundamental paradox of collective life in general. And that is that we all find ourselves not merely to be part of a collective, but to actually be that collective, or more precisely, to be an instance of that collective. And so for him, the central dilemma is as being both individual and collective at the same time. And so for him, acknowledging participation is therefore a moral or ethical claim. So when we acknowledge participation, what we're saying is that I'm responsible for all of the things associated with the corporation in this case, and the corporation is a symbol and instance of the things that I am responsible for. And my interlocutors felt this very viscerally. So for example, there's a chemical engineer who had spent her career working in the oil and gas industry. She was also an environmentalist and a world-class mountain biker. And she would find that if she ever wore the jersey that had her corporate employer's logo on it while she was out on her bike, that she would be flipped off by her fellow cyclists. And for her, this was really frustrating because kind of they were interpolating her as not just being herself, but as representing not just this corporation, but this oil and gas industry in general that kind of they were politically opposed to. So all of the engineers that I met felt this struggle of not being able to control the collective, right? Not even their own company, let alone an entire industry, but they were held accountable by others for that larger group. And so this meant that a lot of them, especially who lived in progressive places or had friends who were very environmentally forward and concerned, they wouldn't divulge their profession to them just because of that equation. So as I think about kind of what this means for those of us who identify as engineering educators, we all know that engineers do more than make ethical judgments and decisions. But so much of the undergraduate engineering ethics education relies on teaching students and working with them as they reason through individually through these ethical dilemmas. My colleague Chin has written a lot about some of those individualistic assumptions built into our undergraduate programs. What my research, and I think others who actually do embedded research inside of corporations, makes so clear is that engineers don't just make judgments, they're always making these collectivities. And these are collectivities that they can inhabit and feel good about, but also very much these are collectives that they're living through because they kind of accept that their own agencies are going to be expressed by others. So they want that collective to be one that resonates with their own ethics. And to me, what I try to emphasize is that engineers don't just encounter corporations as these external entities that bear down on them. And so often when I hear my colleagues talk about corporations, they're treated as though they're just fully external from engineers, and then engineers have this choice to resist them, to stand apart from them as a whistleblower, for example, or to kind of acquiesce to them and give up their own soul in the process. And kind of to go back to Leighton's quote from the beginning. And it's much more complicated. So engineers are instances of these collectives at the same time as they can sometimes step out of them. And in my work, this was most clear when they would start talking about corporations as a they instead of a we. But if we can kind of also think about how engineers experience corporations, not just as an external force, but how they actually are the corporation, I think that opens up really interesting questions for us in our teaching about how we can better help our students think about their intertwined agencies and accountabilities and potentially remake corporations in that process. And so this is my last slide because we're going to have plenty of time for discussion, but this is really what we've been trying to do in the engineering education work and research at these different universities that have mining and petroleum engineering programs. So we worked with about 1,200 students over the 5-year period in order to take what we were learning from the ethnographic research to enrich their undergraduate training, and specifically to provide them an opportunity to develop a critical view of some of the CSR discourses and practices that they would later experience in the workforce. So as one example, one of the ways that the oil and gas industry here in Colorado managed the big controversy surrounding fracking which was happening in the midst of this work, they started hosting these community meetings. And so we had students do so as well and inside of their classes, and we'd bring in research participants and other faculty to be the stakeholders, to help them move from a place in which they were just kind of disseminating lots of facts to try to get people to acquiesce to oil and gas production, for them to think about how the problem of oil and gas production would be differently posed by people who are going to live next to a well. So with that, I'm going to say thank you again and look forward to the discussion.
Amazing. Thank you, Dr. Smith. This is such an incredibly rich ethnographic work, and the critical participation part I find fascinating. So how you translated this research into implications for education at Colorado School of Mines and at your collaborating institutions. So thank you for this work. So next up, we're going to have Dr. Gwen Ottinger lead a discussion with Dr. Smith about her work, or really their shared work. So Dr. Ottinger is Associate Professor at Drexel University in the Department of Politics and the Center for Science, Technology, and Society. She directs the Fair Tech Collective, which is a research group that uses social science theory and methods to promote social justice in science and technology. She's the author of Refining Expertise, How Responsible Engineers Subvert Environmental Justice Challenges, from NYU Press in 2013, which I teach with, and I imagine many of you teach with. So yeah, it's great to have you here, Dr. Ottinger.
It's a real pleasure to be here, and a special pleasure to be in conversation with Jessica about her work. Well, first, I would like to, I don't have prepared remarks, rather I'd like to ask some questions and draw out some of the points in your book that I particularly appreciated. Those of you who have not yet read Extracting Accountability should certainly do so, because Jessica has given you a taste of the sort of important central framing, but there's a lot else in terms of what constructing personhood in this way means for the engineers in their everyday practice. If you know my work, you will know that my particular interest is in engineers' interactions with communities. And that is no small part of what the mining engineers that Jessica's work focuses on are engaged in. And I wonder if you would spend a little more time for us, please, and talk some more about how this distributed personhood plays into the way that mining engineers interact with a variety of publics. And maybe you could just, probably you want to start just by saying, like, well, how do they interact with people? What's at stake in those kinds of interactions?
Definitely. And so the research focused on the mining and petroleum industries, but one of the things that became clear was those enroll many different kinds of engineers. So chemical engineers, lots of environmental engineers, and civil engineers as well. And of course, the geologists and the geological engineers. And what I was noticing through my work at mines was that people in these technical positions were increasingly being called to represent their companies as they were trying to negotiate their relationships with communities. And especially in terms of what we were seeing in Colorado, there was a huge fracking boom, and it was happening not out on ranches or farms primarily, which is kind of historically where it's been, but in the suburbs. And so many of the engineers I came to know just found themselves at a loss for thinking about how to interact with people who seemed so fundamentally opposed to their work. And there were kind of government mandated environmental impact assessment process. There were public hearings hosted by counties and towns, and they found that the format was really constraining because it was this series of people making proclamations and sharing their opinions, but not actually having a dialogue. And so they created new ways of trying to create a platform for having those kinds of interactions, such as that kind of community science fair example. So there were engineers who were kind of on the front lines of trying to translate their work to the people who would be impacted by it, but also to ideally use, kind of as they were going door to door and answering questions, to use that to feed back into the design of how can we create well pads that are kind of less harmful parts of these neighborhoods. But then there were also all of these engineers behind the scenes, because these controversies were so strong that they felt that every little decision they were making all of a sudden would be scrutinized under this question of what would the public perception of a particular decision be, kind of what kind of engines they were using, how big a well pad would be. So kind of in their everyday kind of designing of these infrastructures, they found themselves accountable to people that they didn't have a chance to actually talk with or get to know because they were kind of at their desk.
Did those people to whom they imagined themselves accountable become kind of straw men in some way? Were there, I mean, really, were there personas that they imagined into being? Or I'm curious to know how they understood the personhood of those others.
This is a fantastic question. I think, and there was a variety of responses. And in my work, I kind of lay out at the beginning of the book that I focus on engineers who took social responsibility as an important part of their professional practice. And I had met some who just dismissed it entirely, and kind of thought that industry ought to be able to do what it wanted, and the primary benefit they provided was jobs and revenue, and that should be enough for people to be satisfied. So there were certainly some people who thought of the public in a caricature kind of way, but there were also others who I think took a much more humane approach to trying to understand the people who were living in these kind of front range suburbs, or kind of people, or like especially the mining engineers who were working in places in the global South that didn't have histories of mining and had lots of indigenous populations. A lot of them experienced this intrinsic desire to learn about other people and other ways of life. But eventually kind of this empathy building would break down once kind of the prerequisite of them being there was to make sure that mining or oil and gas production could happen. And so anything that was outside of that frame, I think really was where things broke down.
In your book, you say that the framing of social license to operate gave engineers a way to think about the public as a challenge, not the enemy. And so I'm curious to know whether they've been able to maintain that stance through an increasingly divided politics of the last, well, I don't know, increasingly divided politics over the time that you've been doing this work, for sure.
Yeah, and I noticed a marked difference. I came to Mines in 2012, and the majority of this research kind of was happening in a latent way at the beginning, but then really started in 2015, 2016, and then kind of the writing kind of finished last year or so. And what's been striking to me is, and I make the argument in the book very strongly, that the social license to operate is not radical. What it does is it takes community acceptance or tolerance and it puts a price tag on it. And it treats communities as risks to be managed, rather than as people that we might have empathy for or seek to collaborate with to promote something like sustainable development. So the social license to operate really reinforces kind of this, I don't know, treatment of kind of the public and critics as a risk to be managed rather than kind of as something to really take seriously and respect. And what's been interesting to me over the last few years is watching kind of this rapid ascendance of ESG language, so environment, social, governance. And I think the rapid uptake is for the same reason. So it treats environment, social governance as financial risks to be managed. And there has been such a professionalization of this area of practice that companies have ESG experts, and they've become very good at working with parts of the public that are sympathetic to their own interests, in a way that excuses them from working with people who question resource production itself.
Right. So would it be fair? I hadn't understood exactly, well, I hadn't understood that quote that I said back to you in quite that way before. And I wonder in the I thought, well, oh, it's great if they're seeing folks as a challenge rather than the enemy. But it almost sounds like you're saying they would be affording their opponents more humanity if they did treat them as enemies instead of as risks.
I don't know. I mean, one of the questions that I kept threading through this book, just because it was so important for the research, was this idea of corporate social responsibility as we currently have it in these industries is very much premised around the idea of how can we do resource extraction responsibly. And in some ways, I want to celebrate this and say, yes, of course, it should be done responsibly. But for me, kind of the limit is that there aren't spaces to ask bigger questions about should this kind of this development be done at all, and should it be done here, and should it be done now. And one of the reasons why I became really concerned about this is that the engineers who I met who had worked in these industries for a while and very sincerely felt that they wanted to make them responsible and accountable, they ended up leaving because there wasn't that space to ask those kinds of big questions about why and whether, instead of just how. And so I think we're just missing a really big opportunity to have more collaborative discussions about what role natural resource production should play kind of in our society.
Yeah. I have one more question before it looks like you're starting to stack up some questions from the audience. So that is, you talk about this kind of not representing the corporation, but making your agency in and through, right? Engineers making their agency in and through the corporation. That feels familiar.
Yeah.
And most of us work for corporations, and even those of us who are technically working for nonprofit organizations are often in giant institutions that we both represent in a variety of ways and criticize. And so I'm curious to know, you've told this lovely story about how engineers navigate that. Is it actually any different for them than the rest of us who might be working for some, big corporation? I can't think of many whose motives and whose practices are pure. So
I adore this question, and I thank you for it. I think it was only after reading the book that I realized that many of the dilemmas that I was analyzing and identifying in the lives of my engineering interlocutors were similar to ones that I experienced, and that I would also switch between referring to my campus as a they and sometimes as a we. And so, so I felt that this was actually a very lovely insight, because it has to do about these kind of collectivities in general, instead of just these kind of technoscientific dominant corporations in particular. I think for me, the question of what makes this specific to engineers or their work is a good one. And I guess I think there are two things happening. And the first is that the kinds of decisions that engineers are making and the things that they're building and designing rest on very particular kinds of knowledge, and the potential impacts are so huge. So when you think about the power of a novice engineer to put down a road kind of in a oil and gas kind of field, or kind of this engineer choosing what kinds of tailings management are going to happen, the stakes are just really, really big. And it's harder for people outside of their collectives to influence them. Like they're just not as open and deliberative. So I think that might be one of the shades of difference, but I think the dilemma is a common one.
Do you suppose that it might also have to do with the kind of hierarchies of expertise that we live with, that they are less easily influenced because the domains that they claim to be better and smarter than the rest of us?
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
So I think, Caitlin, would you like to come back and moderate?
Yeah, sure. There's lots of awesome questions. I have like 1,000, so I'll just go by who asked first. So Dershan asked, can you say a bit more about how engineers you interviewed saw the relationship between accountability and responsibility? Did they feel like the structures for accountability and responsibility as they stand are adequate, particularly in the current environment where so many of the challenges in the world implicate engineering work?
Thank you, Darshan, for that question. I tended to find that engineers were much more comfortable speaking about their responsibilities. And when you look through corporate CSR reports or websites, it is also the language of responsibility. And I think my guess is that's because accountability sounds much more enforceable, and it sounds more like a rights framework. Kind of CSR itself is really steeped in this voluntary language, that companies are voluntarily holding themselves to higher standards. And some of the engineers I met felt like that the industry was already doing too much in terms of engaging the public and their concerns. And then many others just felt hamstrung. And I think, to go back to Gwen's last comment, one of the civil engineers I met who had this dream to work for mining and eventually quit because she just saw this endemic devaluing of local knowledge and concerns. And so she couldn't stomach, I think, being a part of that collective. So she left. So I think there's a mix between people who would like to do more, and then they come up against these folks who think we ought to be doing less. But to go back to the social license comment, what that framework does do is it provides people who are advocates for more investments in community relationships and development programs, some justification for those continued investments, because it can be viewed as creating economic value instead of just being a cost center. So yeah, I think it's kind of a mixed bag.
Yeah, because usually we argue that distributed responsibility and distributed accountability is good, that everybody's a little bit responsible. But in this case, it feels like it's almost a pass the buck kind of situation.
Yeah. And so when I disassociate from my institution and I'm like, okay, that's a they, and they're going to do what they want, that's very different than when an engineer sees something really problematic happening. And then they say, okay, that's them, that's a they. And then you have this really problematic thing get built.
Right. And you said that the engineers who are really concerned sometimes just leave, that they give up. And that's really disheartening to hear.
Yeah. And I want to celebrate students and engineers who want to make their career outside of the corporate world and promote social justice kind of from other spaces. And I'm so glad to see programs growing to support them to do that. But I also worry that if we just ignore corporations kind of from the stance of purity politics, we also are just letting it happen. And so for me, there's this catch-22 because I wanted our students to be able to make more accountable decisions and collectivities when they were going out to this corporate world. But the more we train them in this critical corporate social responsibility, the more they were upholding the moral authority of their future employers, right? And helping them manage conflict. So that's where we've been.
Yeah, let me go from that into an issue about collectives. So Sean asks, like, what are these collectives that you're talking about? How do they form? And then Brian, who identifies as Sean's student, says he imagines it would be so frustrating to be identified with a collective that you really actually can't control.
It is. And so these are multiple. So in some sense, there are collectives that are working groups kind of inside of companies, and the company itself kind of is a kind of collective because it gets treated as kind of this monolithic entity by people external to it. But most of the people I met also had created these other networks of similarly inspired people who were working for other companies or kind of for government. And so they had kind of their space to sustain them and feel like they could share that together. And then they would go and try to shape kind of people who didn't align with them already. So kind of they had both of those. I see Sean has another question. Yeah, and one of the things that I didn't appreciate about engineering career paths is how much even the ability to apply for jobs was constrained by markers such as your GPA. So I don't think it's just at Mines, but I think in many of these places, the top tier companies, you have to have a certain grade point average to even interview with them. And so what it means is that students who are very good at playing the GPA game are able to work for companies that have these good external reputations for corporate social responsibility. And then the students that don't have as high of GPAs, they don't have the same option to choose a responsible company to align themselves with. So there are kind of inequities in terms of how people end up at the companies that they do.
Yeah, thanks for that. I was thinking about that too, that we tell students that their greatest power as junior engineers is to choose a responsible company or a company whose values align with theirs. But it sounds like you're saying that's not always true, or that's true in an unfair way.
Yes. And I also think this language of choice is just really telling, right? And we ought to think about what constrains all of those choices.
So true. All right, let me ask you some things about your choices. So Edwin wants to consider how to balance between an insider and an outsider approach. Particularly for you, Gwen has also experienced this issue. How much do you empathize with the engineers? How much do you need to work with them for your career and therefore can't say some things? Like, how do you do that as an analyst?
I would love to hear what Gwen has to say about this. From my perspective, I've always felt like this kind of moving between insider and outsider status. So I'm from this mining town. My family worked in mining kind of from a blue collar perspective. But I never fully lived what they lived, just by virtue of my own education. And so I feel like at mines, in my work, there was this kind of, we all belong to this community together, but some of us belong in different ways, right? And so it's hard being someone who is kind of a thorn in the side of dominant discourses about what we're doing or what these industries ought to do.
And I guess maybe I don't fully understand the question, but I guess my my understanding of the methodology is that we always do both, right? We're always tacking back and forth between how actors understand their space and how an outsider might. And the trick of being an anthropologist is to question the categories. You end up questioning the categories, both that the community that you're studying takes for granted and that your own community takes for granted. And then that's the work of it, is to put, the work of anthropology is to put those sets of categories and ideas into tension. And the fact that, you know, Jessica is able to see all these engineers acting in this way that talks about responsibility and say, okay, but let's think about what happens if we reframe it as accountabilities, which gives us a different purchase on the concept. Like, I think that's the power of ethnographic research. I don't think it's a choice.
No, I would underline that. And I would wish for institutions and collectives that were more welcoming of that kind of critical reflection. And instead of, I think about Leighton's work on the loyal opposition, right? So I think he's onto something, that kind of critical questioning can be treated as treason, right? And instead of as an important part of these spaces that we're kind of occupying.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you both for that. And I would suggest that because we all belong to multiple collectives, some by choice and some less by choice, in some ways, we're all doing that all the time, right? Trying to analyze what the people in this collective think and what we think about that, and then what the people in this collective think, which we also belong to, but we're able to move between them. So yeah, it seems like that's what ethnographers do. That's what we claim to do. And I think that's what everybody has to do to navigate these really complex social and ethical spaces.
I'd also like to just put in a plug for my colleague, John Meyer, a political theory colleague, who talks of the inside critic.
Yeah.
And it's the same, he's working in an environmental space, but it's that same positioning yourself critically while acknowledging your participation, really. So it's a very good book that takes us some of those same places that you're talking about. So I've put a link to the
Cool.
To the presses page in the chat.
Awesome. Thank you. So let's finish with Ryan's question. And he wants to know about regulation of oil and gas and how engineers understood their relationships to those regulations. Just do they see themselves as constrained by regulation or creatively working around them? Do they feel like they are passive recipients of the law or shapers of regulation?
Ryan, thank you for the question. It's both, you know, and so we've been privy, some more than others, to seeing how oil and gas and mining companies are actively shaping and trying to resist regulation on one level. And I think it's very clear that all of this corporate social responsibility movement is in a really, in a very real sense, it's aimed at staving off future regulation, right? So we're going to make this all voluntary. We will monitor ourselves. And so therefore we don't need kind of laws. On the other hand, kind of when I was talking with people, especially who were in leadership positions, they viewed regulation as very empowering for a couple of reasons. The first was that it sets the rules for the game and that they could kind of predict and work within them. And then secondly, I just kept hearing and hearing and hearing, we are the most regulated industry in the world, right? And so they use the existence of regulations that many parts of that industry try to undermine as evidence of their responsibility. So regulation in that sense is a part of their kind of public relations toolkit and a way of asking people to trust in them.
Wow. Yeah, so true. And Jose adds that FAA and Boeing is a good case study of this.
Exactly.
Of this interaction.
Exactly.
Gwen, do you want to say anything about regulation based on the fence line communities that you've studied?
No, well, first I want to direct everybody's attention. There's a very good book by Andrew Hoffman, whose name I don't remember right now, but it basically sort of documents the deregulatory move of the 1980s and how it pulled the rug out from chemical companies in a way that they found really like not helpful at all. I mean, my experience working in fence line communities, there was it's like Jessica was saying, there's this moment where the empathy breaks down, right? And when the win-wins no longer work out, that's when regulation really matters, because there was always a very strong sense that the social license to operate, I mean, that was important. They'd talk about it all day, but when things really came into conflict, it was if it wasn't the law, then it was optional. It was discretionary. And I think that there's an important kind of backstopping, and this isn't from the engineer's experience so much as from sort of the public experience, right? This is the reason why it can't all just be corporate social responsibility, because those regulations play this really important backstopping role in what I've seen.
Right. And the other thing so I've taught a class called Corporate Social Responsibility at Mines for many years now. And one of the themes that we always come back to is that corporate social responsibility configures public participation in a very different way than regulation does, right? So with CSR, they can define who a stakeholder is. They can set up when they're having community meetings and who they're inviting to it. And we don't get to elect the leaders of corporations unless you're a shareholder, and they don't have to submit their plans for public comment unless it's a part of these other regulatory processes. So kind of we tend to, I encourage kind of my students to think about the different ways that kind of CSR versus kind of regulation and differently configures the public, either as stakeholders or as rights holders. And I think this goes back to why the language of accountability is noticeably absent in kind of this space, because it's about voluntary engagement of people that they identify as stakeholders, not about kind of rights-bearing citizens.
Yeah, that's a really interesting note to leave on, this idea of stakeholders versus shareholders. So we invite everyone to continue this amazing conversation on the OEC's discussion boards. So to do that, please follow the link in the chat, which Courtney's going to post for us, to sign up as an OEC member. Membership is free and it gives you access to our newsletter and discussion forums. So you can find the discussion thread for this webinar under the discussion forum link on the members page on the OEC website, which is onlineethics.org. So please join us for our next webinar on March 23rd, featuring Glenn Miller from Texas A&M. And so, yeah, with mega thanks to Dr. Smith and Dr. Ottinger for this fascinating discussion. And also thanks to the OEC's director, Dr. Rosalind Byrne, and our coordinator, Courtney Walker, and the program in Science, Technology, and Society at the University of Virginia. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This has been wonderful.